Hello and welcome to Monarchism Unfiltered. I'm one of your hosts, McCosk.
I'm Ion.
This is Bronze.
Today we're going to be discussing the role of aristocracy in the functioning of states, with monarchies in particular. But I think we can probably also talk about Italian republics, because I think the interaction there of aristocracies, nobilities with non-monarchical states is quite interesting. And then also you can look at places like modern Germany or Africa in relation to how they function. Also maybe Albania, because Albania is an interesting example here. And possibly places in Latin America, though the degree to which those aristocracies can be debated about. So I think the first place to start really is this question of what really was the function of aristocracy. Why did aristocracy become a thing? Because if you look at how, say, if you look at a society like ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia existed, where they have these highly command economies, you do have, courts and things that can be sort of people with titles, but it's highly focused around the functions of religion. And because of the structure of their economy, where it's these like aggressively command economies, the degree to which you can talk about an aristocracy is quite limited. And I think you see the same thing in in early Roman society or in tribal societies in general, where they marry locally. So they will not marry within a caste or within a collection of people, such that you can't really talk about an aristocracy because the people that they're marrying are just the locals. So it's just like a headman. And I think this gets into an interesting question, which is how does one define an aristocracy? Because obviously you can talk about titles, but I think most people would agree that, say, some jumped up hussy who's the king's mistress, who's been granted a duchy or something, without any attached property or land, can't really be called a noble. And so I think the question of what the aristocracy is quite illuminative as to the function of aristocracy. Namely, that if you look at aristocracy within European society, it amounts to a kind of caste within generalized society that marries within, that has certain traditions, that educates in certain areas, and has a kind of group cohesion that, say, dynasts in Ming China might not have.
All that is true. To touch upon the topic that we discussed in the previous episode about Habsburgs in art, there is a degree of self-identification as aristocracy / nobility. In fact, I'm getting ahead of myself. Intertwined with the discussion of aristocracy is the discussion of nobility, because although there's the common perception that both are one and the same, this is not technically true. Aristocracy is a functionalist description, nobility is a substantialist description. This is to say that an aristocrat is anyone who functions as an aristocrat. A noble is any person who is recognized as a noble, typically by the state. So it is perfectly possible for non-monarchical or countries with no nobility to have an aristocracy, because aristocracy comes from the old Greek rule of the best. So that connotation still permeates the word somewhat, even though these days it's used somewhat mutually exchangeable. But the metric here is that all aristocracy is tentatively nobility, but not all nobility is aristocracy. I invoke here the old distinction between high and low nobility, sword and nobility of the robe, blood nobility, etc., etc., etc. Aristocracy, although very joined together, and in monarchies doubly so, this is not the case in, say, in the previously mentioned cases of like Italian city-states, which recognized a nobility but did not have at least a stable aristocracy, or their aristocracy was not dependent upon their nobility. Or Ming China, which vicariously had court nobles, local nobles, court bureaucrats, and the role of aristocracy was fulfilled by a smattering of these at any given point, with the composition not always being in favor of the nobility. So, with that out of this clarification out of the way, when discussing nobility in such wide context, we must first underpin the context that we are discussing. Europe. Actually, I'm going to go a bit here on the limb, but you can break, in the old world at least. The new world, I'm not familiar enough to truly make claims, but you can break the experience of nobility and aristocracy into two overwhelmingly major fields. And these are the Euro-Asiatic one and the African one. This division, somewhat spurious, because again, when we're talking about this division, there's obviously exceptions in both cases. So these are not hard and fast divisions. These are
rough lines in the sand.
Very rough lines in a very, very coarse sand. The basic experience of the Euro-Asiatic experience of nobility vis-a-vis the African ones is their distance from the state. In Africa, the relationship between nobility, aristocracy, and the state was direct, almost immediate, and profoundly interconnected, essentially. Most ancient, classical, well, perhaps not North Africa in states. So again, remember, very rough line on very coarse sand.
Trends in a field of boulders.
Yep. The connection between the aristocracy, the nobility, and the state is very strong. You see this in how, while not having absolutism per se, there is a very strong identification of the state with the ruling family, with various legends and histories of the dynasty or clan being repeated through oral history, sometimes for centuries.
This is because and then you get into distinction of the state being the ruler in a personal and a non-personal way, and that's an episode 1 thing right there. So that's for the true fans.
Yeah, that one guy. Let's not go back to personal versus impersonal, but the connection between the nobility, the aristocracy, and the state was very much tight, very much restricted, because in Africa, more so West African polities than so sub-Saharan and even Sahelian, but this general rule applies, was that in these states the role of the free man or freed warrior case or what have you was much more central, and therefore the group what we would count as nobility / aristocracy was much more restricted, much more compact, to the point that you could say that nobility in historical Africa equalized aristocracy, period. And this aristocracy was often extensions of the state as it existed. So So there is a very strong identification with the state, and the state has a very strong identification with the people. This is very distinct from the Euro-Asiatic experience, Eurasian, not Euro-Asiatic, Eurasian, in that although in a gradient from that isn't universally as separated, but it does exist, and is the self-mutualization of the dynasty. It's essentially the same dynamic I described in Africa, well, minus the free warrior case. That really wasn't the thing in Europe or Asia for that matter. But
often big lines in the sand. If you're in the comments furiously typing away with a 1,000,000,001 exceptions, we know, but the thing can't be 9 hours long. So yeah, we know, but rough lines.
Yeah. Stone patterns in a volcano. Is that you have this mythalization of the aristocratic of the dynasty or the lineage separate from the state. You see this. The extreme manifestation of this is in the Asiatic steppes, with the extreme mythalization of, say, the Ashina dynasty, the Borjging dynasty, Genghis Khan, and so on and so forth, where the mythalization of one or said clan becomes such an accepted fact that they became a kind that, especially in the Ashina case, that they become a sort of international priestly case as far as many of the Goktuk successor states were concerned. In Europe, you also see this with, again, the attention to pedigree, the mythalization of the dynasties, the innumerable saints of Habsburg, though many other aristocratic dynasties did this or eventually adopted this position. In China, you also have this, but again, it's more lineage focused and claiming exalted descent from great generals, great statesmen, or previous Chinese dynasties. And mind you, again, this is China. So it's very long history and it fluctuates a lot through its own history. So you can break down the experience of nobility into these two fields. The African one, generally conceived of, and the Eurasian one, generally conceived of. Obviously, I'm aware that the Americas do exist, and Australia as well, and they have their own dynamic. But at the present moment, I am not well versed enough in their history to make any kind of claims about it. So sorry for not being omni knowledgeable.
That's bad. Why aren't you
Omniscient.
Omniscient.
Skiens. Yeah, I think the other interesting point about the distinction between aristocracy and nobility is that I think it also helps to understand a lot of, say, South American politics, where I think they do quite clearly have aristocracies, like stable families with significant amounts of money and power, even if they don't have nobility. And I mean, in some cases they do because of intermarriage of European nobility. I mean, it's kind of a meme at this point for Spanish nobles to marry Argentine heiresses and so forth. And I think some Portuguese royalty have migrated to Brazil.
It's called the entire noble court fled to Brazil in the 1800s, and like the hilarity of the situation is that the vast majority of the high nobility remained in Brazil, with only the lower and middling nobility returning to Portugal. This is profound social critique to an audience that will not understand the point that's being made. But the trash returned, the fine flower stayed. Wow, no one will get that reference. No one.
I mean,
one person might, McCosk, and that's the dream.
Yeah. Well, one person will, and that'll be McCosk. if he listens through the episode. But I think the interesting part about the function of aristocracy within many of these societies is that there is the obvious usage, which is sort of or the obvious usage of aristocracy landowners as a kind of stable base for statesmen. So your if you look at even in sort of modern France, significant, it's like cousins of knights or so on and so forth are the kind of usual people to become political leaders. Or at school there will be the count in the whatever Jesuit school that these rich people go to, and that's sort of that kind of very obvious usage of nobility, aristocracy, where aristocracy is kind of the caste of people that exist to run the state. When you get into societies like Germany or Italy or France as well. France had this in the sort of in the 19th century and Romanticism. There is very much the support of the arts as a kind of function of the nobility. So Goethe hangs out with kings. He's sort of
royalty bow down in a march to Liszt.
And this
all
kind
that
of
vibe.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Or I mean, you even see this in China with like the but like at a kind of almost comically larger scale, where like there's still the Duke Confucius. I think he is the Duke Confucius.
He is the Duke of something, but he is Duke because he is descendant of Confucius.
Duke Yangsheng, which is honorable overflowing with sagacity, or Holy Duke of Yang.
I think that's the fourth time he's been brought up on this podcast now.
Well, he's very epic.
He's very interesting. I think we should talk about it more, and how he was a minister of the Taiwanese government until 2011, I think.
Yeah, until 2011.
That was a ministerial position.
Yes, and he still does they got rid of it just because it's unpaid. Like it's still they still do the functions. Like so like they as like official. So it went from it was a government position when they were in China, and then it was so in 1935, the nationalist government abolished the hereditary peerages and turned it into a political office. And then in 2008, they made it an unpaid position, and I think it still has the official status of basically being a cabinet minister, like the same ranking. So they're still around, and they still do the state ceremonies. So like the blessing of the state and so forth, like the all of that. So I think and that was created in 206 BC. So it's kind of it is very interesting how if you look at China, they still have, or at least the Republic of China do have, a kind of direct relationship with what could be considered nobility, as distinct from an aristocracy, which I think is very interesting. I think it's kind of very interesting to see how there are these remnants of Chinese culture and so forth that are still deeply honored by the Chinese, by parts of the Chinese state and society in general. And I think it's something interesting to consider. I think also, if you look at, I think if you look at China in general, and it is kind of interesting that they don't have at least to me, they don't seem to have a stable aristocracy in the same way that most of Europe seems to have, or even parts of the Middle East. And I think that is in large part because of the way that the centralism of the Chinese state and like the ethnic loyalty of the Manchus.
It's it's a mixture of like, well, the first Chinese state, the Qi dynasty, was oh god, oh boy, here comes a very brief overview of Chinese history and its relation to aristocracy. To understand it, you must understand the following: paranoia. That's it. From as early as the Qin dynasty to as late as the Qing dynasty, the attitude towards its aristocracy, its land-owning aristocracy or nobility, has always been one of paranoia of the utmost, with one or two dynasties not being paranoid about it, and eventually the dynasty falling into pieces with it, with internecine civil war. Via princes, cousins, and brothers being the example of that's why the opposite never quite stuck, because the two particular experiences of it were not very good. Another thing we have to be aware is purges. China conducted a lot of purges, and a lot of these purges were entire aristocratic clans in and out. Another issue is that counting, basically. Because although a lot of Chinese noble titles have a direct equivalency to European ones, dukes, counts, etc., marquises, barons, you name it, there is an equivalence. The Chinese nobility law, if one could use this term, I guess, is wacky. For example, in the late Qin dynasty, you had a thing called the iron-capped princes. What were the iron-capped princes? Well, they weren't called that because they wear the iron hat. No, they were called that because their nobility had an iron cap on it, which is to say it didn't degrade with succession, which was a hallmark of Chinese nobility as the centuries went forward. In that, for example, let's imagine you were named a duke. Your son would be a count, his son would be a baron, and his son would be a commoner. This is what kind of complicates the history, because there is a lot of this, especially as time went forward. You would either have to receive an absurdly high title, to which point the degradation you would remain noble timelessly, because also sometimes the degradation wasn't complete, or you would eventually, unless continually reviving your aristocratic privilege via service to the state, noteworthy service to the state, mind you, you ran the serious risk, your family ran the serious risk of losing the status. So there are a lot of factors that complicate the accounting, but generally speaking, we can speak of at least some standout noble slash aristocratic lineages that lasted a few good centuries and survived a couple of dynasties, as it were. But you don't have the Bragacionis basically, or like stuff like the Paula, whose ancestry goes literally to the BCE times and is still going strong today. But you do have some standout examples. Though again, another issue with the counting is that uh, as far as Western sources are concerned, the counting is done by the title rather than done by the dynasty. And although rare to award an already extant title to a different aristocratic lineage, it sometimes did happen. Adoption was also a common phenomenon, which, depending upon your period of Western historiography, that was a make or break effort. So I'm sure more recent sources probably have a better picture, but the ones I'm familiar with paint a very fractal image, and not all of these divisions are really justified when one tries to understand what nobility and aristocracy meant for China under Chinese lens. So, in short, to really simplify this, yeah, probably, but not that big and not that long in terms of lasting lineages.
I think it is interesting. Also, if you compare like this to say is it the golden lineage, Borge?
Borging, yeah.
The Borging, yeah, like that is. I mean, that's sort of 500 years going strong almost. Like like it continues until pretty much the Soviets. Like and I mean, you can probably find people who are still who are like still have lots of land in Afghanistan or Pakistan and claim descent. So
have people over there that claim descent from Greek colonists. So in Afghanistan, everything is possible.
yeah, and I think the
That's why they call it Afghanistan, the land of dreams.
Yeah, the great empires will like.
I mean, I think the Grave of Empires stuff is overplayed because, like, I mean, I can think of a lot of empires that went through there and were fine. It's sort of when you
that started there and were fine.
Yeah, well, yeah, even empires that started there. I think it's just the fact that, like, the British had 3-4 wars with them, that and like the Russians tried to take it over. Yeah, no, I mean, also, like, if you just think about the fact that the Safavids controlled it at various periods of time, I think the more important question, the more interesting question about these kinds of noble lineages is that it's kind of interesting how there's such like a massive distinction there of if you compare the sheer length of time that something like the Mongol dynasties were around, and like the sort of that claiming of descent from Genghis Khan to the fact that there's sort of complete replacement of Chinese dynasties, and in many cases these kinds of I think the other interesting point is that China at least is like less interested in blood descent. So like the last few Qing rulers were basically unrelated to prior Qing rulers, because they were nephews of the Dowager Emperor Shiji. So they were still in the dynasty. They were still like Asengoro, but they weren't directly related to prior people. And this is actually, so I think it's more of a break than say what you see in other places, that like I can't really think of a comparable event or set of events that doesn't take a civil war in Europe.
You had the succession crisis in Portugal, where outside of the Spanish intervention in one of them, the statistical response was, "Yo, let's pick the bastard because the bastard has a closer bloodline relation to the previous king, rather than the cadet branch, which is more legitimate." So there are similar things. Yeah,
That's almost directly the opposite.
as I said, it's you asked which one didn't involve a civil war, and I gave you two examples. I never said the similarity was close, but yeah.
But yeah, but I think that helps with my point, which is that I think, like especially if you look at like the Confucian dukes, like they're very, because there's so many descendants of Confucius now. They just kind of choose, like they have systems to choose who they want. And I think that, and they're also thinking of letting female descendants be the Duchess, Holy Duchess of Sagacity. So,
as said, China was big on adoption. So the aristocratic lineage, and also, dear listener, we're talking China. When we're talking China, we're talking an extremely long period of time. So when we're saying, yeah, they were big on adoption. Bloodline didn't matter that much, and there existed kind of a kind of institute. It was more important to have like institutional continuation more so than bloodline connection. This becomes more applicable as time goes on in China. So by the Song dynasty, this was well in place. It becomes less the case the further back you go. So just to quantify.
I think the other interesting, to sort of return to the earlier questions about like the function and role of aristocracy, I think it's kind of interesting to look at places like Burgundy or the Holy Roman Empire, when it's sort of very decentralized, where you have often incredibly local aristocracy that is still sort of recognizably like a nobility, that they marry within the general nobility. They aren't they don't marry locally. They are so on and so forth, but then they are sort of incredibly local. It's like a Freiherrs and so forth of almost of towns, basically.
The Free Imperial Knights, never forget.
Yeah, and Free Imperial Knights, so on and so forth. And
it's very interesting that you mentioned this, because this is an excellent segue into the interaction of the Italian city-states and their nobility, because a lot of their nobility is actually Holy Roman nobility that stood behind. Although Italy never formally separated from the empire,
I think they did.
It was never official. For example, Milan never officially did. Venice is debatable if it even was ever part of the empire per se. Tuscany never did. Tuscany never did because the elevation of the Medicis to Duke and later Grand Duke was had to be confirmed by both the Pope and the Emperor. which is which was something that would have been irrelevant in part of the interference of the emperor. That is, if they had succeeded. Italy never formally succeeded. Basically, the de jure situation in northern Italy vis-a-vis the Holy Roman Empire is complicated. I remember the quote unquote legal formulation was a lot of the states got conquered by other states that weren't or were formed outside of the empire, and therefore the legal fiction was that they got annexed outside of the empire rather than they split. It's bizarre, but yeah, there was no formal northern Italy-wide succession from the empire.
That's very interesting.
Holy Imperial Roman legal fictions are wild.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is kind of interesting. I mean, Venice, I think, believed that it was independent and had always been independent.
Yeah, at the same time, early on, it's very complicated because Venice, early in its history, liked to play fence sitter between the Byzantine Empire and the Carolingian/Holy Roman Empire. So it's even more complicated in that. I don't think they were ever like part of the empire in the same way, say, Bavaria, Upper Lorraine, or Saxony were, but like periods of that where they recognized the suzerainty of the Holy Roman Emperor, specifically in opposition to the Byzantine Emperor as time went on, was a thing.
That's interesting because that's almost comparable to the Ostrogoths, where the Ostrogoths recognized themselves as vassals to the Byzantine Emperor.
Wasa before them.
Yeah. Odoacer recognized the universal emperorship of the Byzantines.
As I said, late Roman and Holy Roman legal fictions are a wild place, but we're getting sidetracked.
But I think it's relevant in terms of especially for what you were saying about because I mean the creation of titles is especially in the Middle Ages is not something you can't pull a Napoleon and crown yourself emperor. You have to get some kind of recognition of your title.
Fountain of honor, is the technical term.
Yeah.
But back then it was easier. In fact, it was, depending upon which region of Europe you were, it was incredibly easy to attain nobility. Attaining aristocracy was much more difficult. I mean, until the 16th, 17th century, where kings started to reserve to themselves the right of fountain of honor. Basically, it's one of their powers. Even in constitutional monarchies, that's one of the powers they have. Even if by constitution they're no longer able to use it, the fountain of honor is the power to confer nobility onto another person, family, clan, what have you. And in ye olden days, every noble was their own fountain of honor. So any other noble could ennoble another noble, so long to either ranks below them or up to their rank. The up to their rank was very rare, but that's how we got a massive amount of knights, as we did, massive comparatively. It was like counts, barons, and what have you, ennobling people. I mean, the joke is that in Reconquista Portugal, I've been informed that in Spain it was a similar manner, though perhaps not so quick. But it was not uncommon for, say, a town guard or castle guard, so long as he wasn't a yeoman. So basically, if you were a free man and you did this for a good few years, mind you, we're talking 10 years of this, which back then was basically your life. You would most likely get knighted at the end, just straight up. Peasants to knights was very difficult. Almost unheard of it, but free man to knights in the Iberian Peninsula was a fairly common occurrence during the Reconquista. In fact, that largely explains how by the time by the time the 16th century rolls around, how 10 to 15% of Spain's population can claim nobility. And if you want an even more extreme example, you have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which via a similar dynamic, by the time the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was established, up to 30% of the population could claim nobility and therefore voice in the Sejm, which hilariously enough meant that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had a wider suffrage than America for centuries. So food for thought.
Interesting. I mean, so I think that is kind of interesting about the Fountain of Honor, and I mean, I think that probably also relates to why you don't see any kind of priest kings in Europe, where, like, if you look at, say, if you look at even like how the French revolutionaries operate themselves, they operate as a kind of priesthood of the nation. I mean, this is like what Masonry in general was interested in.
Oh yeah, thanks for reminding. This also applied to.
Well, I mean, you see priest kings in Scandinavia later.
You see that, and more to the point, you see the relationship between nobility and the clerical hierarchy, as it were. Until the Reformation was a very complicated and interesting thing, because it's what was because if every noble was had a fountain of honor, and your clerical hierarchy was neither peasant nor freeman, and a significant component of it were like sons of nobility, did they also have the fountain of honor? And this was kind of like a dispute. Well, a dispute is perhaps too strong a word, but in like low level, yo, this is my fief. No, this is my fief. Wait, you ain't a noble. Oh yes, I am. I got knighted by the bishop. Wait, and the other dude says no, that doesn't count. In a wider scale, this never like bothered the wider European world at large. But yes, the Pope, archbishops, I think cardinals, as far as the old papal states were concerned, and at the extreme limit, bishops could I think, because now I'm really straining my memory, I think bishops could theoretically ennoble people. I don't know if that was in their capacity as members of the church or in their capacity as landowner.
Well, it would be both.
It would be both. You know, especially because in some countries like the UK, they would also be lords by.
Yeah. But so I wasn't really talking about like, because the thing is, there's a clear distinction between a prince bishop and a priest king or a sacred king. And I think even if you look at someone like the Pope is not a priest king. He's not a sacred king. There's a
He's a pope. He's a priest who happens to be a king.
Yeah, he's a priest who happens to be a king. Whereas if you look at like the Emperor of Japan, the Emperor of Japan is a priest king. This is why he's like considered a god, because his divinity, and divinity in Japanese is a more general term than it is in the West, is because he is priest king. He is the person who makes the universe turn around its axis, basically. That's like literally his role. And I mean, this is where they get the foundations of their Pan-Asianism and so forth. It's also what the function of the Chinese emperor was, and it's why the Chinese Republic continues to recognize the Holy Duke of Yan, of sagacity, Duke Confucius, because and why the president does state rituals, because when the Chinese Republic came into existence, it was about the centralization of the Chinese state into a modern form, such that they could, expel the foreigners, so forth. And the concept of the sacred king is specifically this concept of the person who makes the universe go around. And so it's interesting. The reason why this is interesting in relation to nobility and the fact that nobles used to be able to make other nobles, or the closest comparison, I think, in terms of the Catholic Church, that bishops are allowed to make other bishops. So 3 bishops, in Orthodoxy, 3 bishops can make a bishop. Now they have to be recognized by the Pope. So the Pope has had this process of centralization of the fountain of honor in relation to the priesthood. And more importantly, they have taken control of the process of making saints. So up until the 13th century, I think, any bishop could declare pretty much anyone a saint.
Yeah, but it was usually done by a couple of bishops together.
Yeah, so a local synod would, which is what the Orthodox still do. So that I think is the most comparable thing that you can talk about with relation to prince bishops, where if you're a prince bishop in the 11th century, of which there were a few, you are both allowed to make nobles and you are allowed to make saints, which would be the nearest thing that I can think of. The taking of the fountain of honor is quite interesting in relation to the English monarch, because the English monarch, especially post under the Stuarts, does seem to take a kind of sacral kingship role. And especially in Prussia, when they sort of start getting into masonry, the Prussian king and the Hanoverian kings are sacred kings. So this is like...
I'd argue the Scandinavian kings too.
Well, the Scandinavian kings probably earlier.
Yeah.
And I think this is the interesting thing about masonry in general, is that masonry, the fact that Masonic lodges kind of invariably were headed by the king or the king's brother or king's son, which does somewhat still happen in the UK and Scandinavia. And I think it happens in Germany, but with like princes. Kind of has led to like a move back to sacred kingship that you see kind of die in the West, because, and I think this is probably why there isn't a nobility in, there isn't a nobility in the Byzantine Empire. There's dainatoi, like large landowners, but there isn't a nobility. And the Byzantine emperor is very much a sacred king, which I think is very interesting with regards to this relationship between nobility and aristocracy, because I think when you get into a situation where there is equality between the nobility of blood and the nobility of the robe, that I think is the point at which aristocracy begins to die. And I think you see this most clearly in Britain at the moment. Because if you look at a place like Germany, because in Germany there was never equality and I think this is because the king, the German king, the German emperor never really takes the fountain of nobility. Like the king of Bavaria can still make people counts and dukes, like right up to the end, and even smaller people, which means that if you're a count because you're like a mistress or whatever, or a countess you're a count because you're like because you're in a homosexual relationship with the king. You are not recognized anywhere to the same degree as just straight up nobility. I mean, even sort of philosophers were sort of had higher positions than most of like the court nobility, like were more highly regarded, as you see with Leibniz and Christian von Wolff or Goethe.
But that's because like the court nobility, especially as time went on, started to also be seen as a bunch of degenerates. It fixed it righted itself up in the 1800s a bit, but there's a reason why if you go up to fucking TV tropes and you start like looking tropes by title, counts and barons whose positions were, as time went on, started being bought. The prestige of the title went down the grade, and like that's where you start having literal Satan with a title of baron or count as time went on, as opposed to like your barons Munchausen and previous figures where they were seen as like the little aristocrat that could. But as is usual, we got massively sidetracked to like the topic, to like the historical experience. So let's one last hurrah to recenter this on the OG topic of their social function. And again, as is typical and traditional, and this is because this is the majority of our audience and also the area of our expertise, the Western European, well, Western in general, European in particular, experience of the function of nobility. The stereotype was that they served for military affairs. This maintains itself to this day. Even in most republics, military families are but a continuation of this. Many a military family has straight up aristocratic roots down to this day. The general psychological explanation is that nobility is a lot about duty, military army is all about duty as well. So a kind of structural overlap tends to happen as time goes on. Though do mind, this is your lower to middling nobility. Your grand dukes and etc. do not typically serve in the armies as officers or soldiers. As time goes on, you start seeing the rise of the nobility of the robe. These are your bureaucrats, basically. The role they play varies. In Catholic Europe, although they were prominent, yes, they received fierce competition from the clergy, because this is where you start really having because as the state becomes more bureaucratized and more based on writing, is where the clergy's ability to read becomes that much more central. And because in Catholic Europe, the nobility weren't the sole ones with access to writing, and depending upon the country, the nobility even didn't want to learn how to read and to write, because they thought learning how to read and to write is a thing of peasants and commoners and not something of their own status. Note, the nobilities that had this belief, and the matching of countries that went into steep decline in the 1700s is almost 1-to-1, aka Portugal, Spain, France. So yeah, be careful with your beliefs, people. They can fuck you up. In the Protestant countries, the nobility played a far central role because the clergy no longer existed. So there was only one class of people who knew how to read, and they managed to achieve a much stronger monopoly of state power. That's how a good example of this is Sweden. And that's how Sweden went from a centralized state to to a decentralized state in the 1500s, to once again a centralized state with the Swedish Empire, to once again a decentralized state, to finally a centralized state with the instrument of government in 1725, and a so-so state that has been the case till now. This is why you see a growth in Protestant countries of local aristocrats being able to demand, even relatively low level aristocrats get a tremendous rise in influence in Protestant countries. While in France you had the opposite of your Cardinal Richelieu and your Mazarin, who became,
which I mean, it was Italians, but we call him Mazarin for some reason. Mazarin.
In which you had this tremendous percolation of clerical power within the state apparatus. In Portugal and Spain, it's a mix of both, because in the 1700s we had the Marquis de Pombal, who nominated his own brother, who was in the church, to be fair, but as the head of the Inquisition. In the Iberian Peninsula, it becomes more complicated, but the trend in Catholic Europe is that nobility, in its role as functionaries of state, had severe competition from the clergy, something that did not happen in Protestant Europe. This is kind of why you see how this is why you see a stronger literary and artistic tradition from part of the nobility in Protestant Europe than you see in Catholic Europe. Both later developed both later converged, but the Protestant ones started earlier as opposed to the Christian ones, which started later. And I mean continuous tradition, not like individual dude or a singular branch that had a reputation for it, because that's when you start seeing the rise of liberal professions, and you see Protestant aristocracy starting to take jobs as a regular thing due to Protestant ethics, which was never a thing universally established in Catholic aristocracy. The old Roman ideal of let's be so wealthy we don't have to work a day in our lives was very much something to aspire to, which with sometimes bizarre results as far as foreign policy and international trade are related, actually.
Yeah, there's the you see a lot in old books that when someone's a bit of a social climate, they demeaningly refer to them as smelling of the workshop.
I mean, but you see, I mean, to point how strong this trend is. The Habsburg dynasties, clearly a regular on the show, were famous for many things, but amongst other things, that every member of the House of Habsburg was obliged to get a goddamn job. This typically did not mean hard labor, but service in the army, intellectual, artistic pursuits, painters, sculptors, geologists, historiographers, you name it. The Habsburgs contributed a lot of them. Not are any of them particularly well known? Not really, but they did contribute in their own way. A lot of collections, especially of geology. There was one Habsburg princess who really went ham on geology and gave Vienna basically the start of its geology museum via her. Apparently, the work was also pretty damn good. So yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing to say about Rome and opposition to labor, to work. The literal translation of idleness in English to Latin is otium, and in Greek the term is skole. And skole is where we derive the term scholasticism from, or scholar, school, scholar, all of these terms. And yeah, and yeah, I mean, I think if I'm remembering my Aristotle correctly, he says at the start of the Metaphysics that all of philosophy begins with idleness, which I think it's a very interesting thing if you compare sort of modern views on work with the fact that the literal term for education in Greek derives from their word for laziness, or idleness, because laziness is slightly is distinct. Negotiation is derived from idleness. But yeah, I mean, it also has like connotations of contemplation, those sorts of things.
Sadly, the 17th century to early 18th century Western Catholic nobility did not have such ideals. They did have them to the degree in that they saw themselves as patrons of that, don't get me wrong, but actual doers, nah.
Well, I mean, they did like a Roman gentleman is not like a doer. Like if they are a doer, it's sort of they write poetry. Like you don't paint, you might do architecture, like planning, but you don't do, and you might like discuss philosophy, but you aren't, or write literature. But yeah, art was looked down upon. Music,
periods that, again, we're talking an extremely long period of time, so the trends varied. For example,
this is quite because it's written about. This is like Cicero. Cicero wrote down like what was good and bad, and like it's music gets rehabilitated somewhat because of like Plato and the Platonists. So the Platonists of like they're like, oh, music is great.
Yeah, by the time of the medievals come around, music is you can do music, especially if you're a woman. Then that's the thing.
Like and as like again, this varies a lot, and like when we're already going roughshod through the timeline, but yeah. So by the time we kind of enter the nadir of Western Christian nobility, by the time we reach the French Revolution, after the French Revolution is when we really start to have this revival of nobility to a degree. And history isn't particularly kind to them as functionaries.
They still run the French army, so like if you look at I think the chief of staff of the French army is a duke.
It still continues. Like many people wonder where's some. Well, not many, but people have asked me where is today's nobility, and the response is bankrupt, in the army, or not in the country. That's the joke answer. Yeah, well, not only Spain, but everywhere else. So a more fair answer is they typically are in the country. They just like to keep a low profile, basically. So statistically speaking, in the army or some other liberal profession, researcher, lawyer, judge, stuff like that. So yeah, it's surprise, surprise. Contrary to popular belief, nobility isn't nouveau riche and like keeping a low profile. So that's why it's kind of difficult unless one goes hunting for it to find them.
Was Charles de Gaulle?
No.
No.
It's just there.
He does have a de in his name, but that it's not a the having de in your name is not doesn't necessarily mean you're noble.
Yeah, France, along with Portugal, did not have a nobility particulate in the name. It's in case one's wondering what's nobility particulate one. It's the German von or zu and du, which kind of means headquarters or from or area of operations in a very oblique sense. Not all languages have a nobility particulate. Heck, not even the same country, in this case Italy, has the same nobility particulate. The North, I think, does. The South doesn't. It's complicated. So yeah, noble particulates are not are not a surefire way, unless of course you're in Germany, where they're still not perfect, but 70% of the time on the money.
They have the titles and their surnames now.
I mean, in Portugal, it used to be you write your name, because I mean it was hilarious, because a king did not need to write his title; he just wrote his 21 first names. The rest of the aristocracy wrote their full name and then in parentheses after their title. That was the experience in Portugal. I'm not particularly sure how it was in Spain and thereabouts, but that was how it was carried late into the monarchy. Again, so we're still talking about this to like start wrapping to like bring the episode a bit to a conclusion here. We're talking about like here functions in a wider societal case, but where they play a role very consistently and systematically was in local politics. This role was very central in the early 18th century and declined sadly as time went on, though not universally, as those who watched the Q&A episode will remember that we mentioned how there are still some local nobles who play ceremonial functions, no doubt, in some localities, but their real role was local nobility. And here we invoke the true distinction. Aristocracy died, nobility endured, basically, because those that truly survived were not your. To say they didn't truly survive is perhaps a bit too harsh. They also did, but those that survived in a manner and kept like actually the deference from their co-citizens to themselves were those that typically remained local and involved in local societies. So your municipal councils, depending upon the exact time period, the local legislators, etc., etc., etc. It's in this function, especially of the locality, that we now kick off to post-Columbian America to talk about the Creole aristocracy of colonial Spain and the landholders and the citizen landholders, aristocrats of the American Republic itself. This is a very complicated history that we should have covered in more detail, probably for another episode. But suffice to say this: the Creole aristocracy of Spain was a caste system, not a nobility. Because, as said, you could rise in nobility, hard as that may be, and especially as time went on, it became very restrictive. In Spain, the only way forward was downwards, because it was based upon your skin tone, basically. A large number of colorful terms to describe mixtures of people were applied and created in Spain. In colonial Spain. Portugal also had the terms, but because a not insignificant part of our actual nobility migrated to the colonies, the caste system never really got established because there was no real need, though we did use the terms, though they are less charged in Portuguese than Spanish. So that's a fun place for interactions right there between, say, Mexicans and Portuguese. It's hoo boy, just be careful what you say. The Creole aristocracy has an important function there because, as I said, they were literally the local law, the local elite, and the local police force, if not at times the local army, as was the case in the Revolutionary War. In fact, during their wars of independence, the hilarity ensued in that you had the mixed population being pro-Spanish kingdom vis-a-vis a Creole aristocracy of mainly whites and pure Spanish descent being pro-independence. That being the subsequent hilarity of the situation. Although you did have some later attempts by these aristocracies by these Creole aristocrats to establish a monarchy in the Americas. Ecuador came closest. Chile had a movement for it, but it was 1930s related to weirdo fascism. It's complicated. But Ecuador came close into actually inviting a Spanish duke to become their overall, or their, I think, king or prince. I can't remember the title that they were planning. That never went through. Uh, in Latin America, the Creole aristocracy was much more exploitative because they simply were an aristocracy. They were not a nobility. Their power did not came from their blood or from their social station, which was static. It came from their amount of money that they extracted, which was not necessarily the case with European nobility. In fact, if it were, the bourgeoisie would have never managed to overthrow them. Because nobility, no matter how degenerate they might end up, typically know that living for the sake of money is living like a dog. The Creole aristocracy had no such compunctions and tended to be viciously exploitative. That a large part of its population, of the civilian population, were their former slaves or in slave-like conditions, didn't help. I remind you, even peasants in medieval Europe not only had their own hierarchy, but also had their own ability of legal recourse. Such things were not the case for the Creole aristocracy, which tends to be very vicious, very malicious, and of course there are exceptions, but there are very minute exceptions. A lot of the conceptions that Americans get of the nobility are but these vultures and harpies that oppress the people for almost sport come from basically Latin America's experience and memory of their Creole aristocracy, rather than say any widespread European experience with the matter. Then again, the European experience of aristocracy was highly varied, but what it being so universally trashed here is from the Creole aristocracy of Latin America. To further go back, especially into the role of legislator, and this is now we go into the to post-colonial America, though colonial America as well. It becomes very interesting because you had groups of people, families, who were called the Boston Brahmin. This applies more to colonial era than necessarily post-colonial, though there was a carryover. And the Boston Brahmin were, somewhat jokingly, the untouchables. Not in the negative sense of the untouchable case of India, but untouchables in that they were so above the system, to a point that they were a system. These Boston Brahmins were basically the colonial elite over there, and their position was characterized by they being landowners, being well read and capable, and like being well versed in law. British nobility followed a similar pattern at the time, but the landholder as a patriarchal figure, lawmaking figure, was especially that stronger connotation was very American in development.
I think to kind of conclude, we can conclude with the sort of death of the American nobility, the American aristocracy, because the American nobility was expelled with the War of Independence. At the end of the War of Independence, there was sort of a massive land seizure, and the nobility were expelled. But there continued to be an aristocracy, really, up until probably the 1920s. But the real death of the American aristocracy was with the anti-rent war and because after the anti-rent war in the 1840s, they then get the American Civil War, when there's such a rise in the amount of new money because of the wealth acquisition, that I think you transfer from money primarily based upon land to money based upon based upon factories. And the anti-rent war is interesting just because it was basically, I mean, you can compare it to like Maoist anti-landlord campaigns entirely conducted by like local people in upper New York. So that I think is the point at which the American aristocracy, the United States aristocracy dies, basically. And shortly after that, obviously you still have old money and so forth, but they have nowhere near the influence that they did pre-Civil War.
Again, as is usual, a bit of a scatterbrain episode. But before we finish, one last moment, I would like to inform the listeners who aren't in the Discord server that this topic was suggested by a member of Discord. So if you want to suggest your own episode, feel free to join the Discord and suggest your topic.
Yeah, and also remember to email us or Discord us or whatever about the 1,000,001 inaccuracies and this and all our other episodes, and but while you do that, make sure to like, subscribe, and reblog.
This has been Monarchism Unfiltered. I am.
I've been Nicole.
And I've been Bronze. Good night.